Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our panel discussion on American education reform. What's next? My name is John Kim. I'm a senior lecturer and the William Bloomberg Fellow here at HBS. I've been involved in education reform since graduating from here 20 years ago. In fact, it's my 20th reunion this year. And I'm very privileged to have the chance to be teaching the next generation of leaders who are going to make a difference in public education reform. We have until 10:30 together, so I'd like to leave ample time for discussion among our panelists and all of you. So what I'd like to do is first briefly introduce our panelists this morning. Let me then first frame the discussion that I'd like to have, and then I'm going to open it up for questions and discussions with all of you. And by the end of this session, I hope that you'll have a deeper understanding of some of the challenges facing the nation around K-12, and hopefully leave with some ideas, some inspiration, and some next steps for all of you. So I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel this morning, not only because they're all graduates of Harvard Business School, but I also have a personal connection with each of them. So let me just briefly introduce them, and then their bios are, I think, in your program booklet as well. Stacey Childress is a graduate of 2000. She is the Deputy Director of Innovation in Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The connection I have is that I have taken over her course here called Entrepreneurship and Education Reform, and I'm very grateful for the way she has designed and built and have taught the course for many years. So welcome, Stacey. And Laureen Sperling, who is a graduate of 1982. She's the president of the Sperling Family Charitable Foundation, but she and I also work on a board of a national board called Building Educated Leaders for Life, and she has been a terrific leader on that board in pushing education reform from that perspective. And Monique Thompson, she is actually a section mate of mine. In fact, I sat on that side and she sat on this side, and we looked at each other for a whole year. And she has been a leader and an entrepreneur in this space since graduating as well. She is currently the president of Teach Plus, which works to improve teacher effectiveness and bring voice to teachers around the country. So let's give a round of applause welcoming our panelists. So let me briefly frame our discussion for this morning. So 1 in 6 people in the United States went to school, public school today. So that's 50 million children from kindergarten to 12th grade. We spend more than 4% of our GDP, which amounts to more than $600 billion per year. That means every waking day, we're spending about $1.5 billion as a nation. And there are signs that this system is working for many people. We have terrific business people, people in the arts, literature, entrepreneurs, scientists. But there are also signs that this is not working for vast numbers of children in this country. When we compare ourselves internationally, we ranked first in the Olympic medal count this past summer. But in math, we're 26th, 14th in reading, 22nd in science. And in one often cited study by McKinsey, the consultants have said if we performed as well as the top performing nations, our GDP would be $2 trillion higher per year. It's 15% of our GDP. And even if you believe that these comparisons internationally are not that important, and we look just at what's happening in our own country, our high school graduation rates have really not budged. It's about 75%. It's come up a little bit this past year. And probably the most troubling is the difference in performance when we compare by race or socioeconomic status. So Black and Latino students are 2 to 3 years behind when they're very young, and they never catch up. Students from the lowest income households, only 8% of them graduate from college. And this is despite our country having spent in real terms, more than doubling our spending in real terms over the last 30 years. But not to leave you all doom and gloom, that being said, there are some pockets of effort and programs and ideas that are proving that income and zip codes do not have to determine destiny. And I think our panelists today are going to be giving us several perspectives on some of those ideas that are out there and what perhaps all of you can do to get involved in some of that. So let me start off by asking Stacey to give us a little bit of background, the work that she's involved in, and then we'll go through each one of them. And once they have all spoken, then I'll open it up for questions. So Stacey?
Great, thank you. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I guess I'm on here, or maybe this is just for the, it's just for the, okay, so I'll just speak up. It's great to see everybody. It's great to be back in Haws 102. This was always one of my favorite classrooms to teach in. This feels much more, I'm much more nervous about this than I ever was about that. But it's good to be here. As John mentioned, I left Harvard Business School for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation almost 3 years ago. So 3 years ago in May. And I lead a team called the Next Generation Learning Team. So let me tell you a little bit about, come back into what the team does by talking a little more about some of the things that John was highlighting. The Gates Foundation has a slogan. It's that all lives have equal value. And the way that gets expressed at the foundation around the world is a little different than in the U.S. So in the developing world, the foundation focuses on things like public health. So you probably know about some of the work in vaccines, maternal and child health, new growing focus on contraception, which is a little bit controversial in some parts of the world, including here sometimes. But the analysis there was one of the big barriers that keeps the motto, all lives have equal value, from being true on the ground in a lot of developing countries has to do with public health issues and diseases. And things like clean water and sanitation. The foundation recently did a contest to redesign toilets for the developing world. You may have seen some of that. They have one out right now about condoms. Our work is not nearly that exciting in education, but we're not into toilets and condoms, but we're doing some other things that I'll tell you about. In the U.S., Bill and Melinda looked around a decade or so ago and said, got a long way to go on healthcare, obviously, but it seemed that the barrier to kind of living up to our American ideal of equality had to do with what John talked about, was these disparate outcomes by race and class, and quite frankly, by zip code. They're very geographically concentrated, these lower outcomes in the achievement gap and opportunity gap. And so in the U.S., they decided to focus on education. So here are a couple of other stats that we think a lot about. So our goal at the Gates Foundation is that by the year 2025, 80% of students that graduate from high school that year, so the class of 2025, 80% of them will graduate with everything they need to be successful in college and in their careers. So that's academically, social, emotionally, things like grit and tenacity, that 80% of the kids in the country will graduate with that. We've got a lot of data on what's going on now academically. So the class of 2012, which graduated last year, you can use a bunch of different proxies for college readiness, but just use the ACT since it's one that most of us will know. Only 25% of the graduating class of 2025, based on the 54% or so of kids in the country that took the SAT, so more than half the kids in the class of 2012 actually took the ACT last year, or a couple years ago. Only a quarter of them scored on the sections of that exam high enough to predict that they'll earn a C or better their freshman year in college. We know a lot about first-year college success and its predictiveness of persistence, graduation, lifetime earnings, those kinds of things. A quarter of the kids in the country that took the ACT scored at a level that would predict a C or better their freshman year in college. We've got some problems. So what's interesting about that is the class of 2025 are kindergartners this year. Last year, about a quarter of kids graduated ready to be successful in college. We're saying that kindergartners this year, by the time they graduate, we think they and all of their classmates around the country, regardless of what zip code they're in, that 80% of them should be ready for college. We got a long way to go. So what do? As John said, we've doubled spending over the last 30 years. Results have been about flat. Spent a lot of time and political energy and fights on accountability. Want to measure schools better. That seems like a good thing to do, and we've been doing it. We want to make sure teachers are better prepared. We want to make sure that they get evaluated appropriately, and that if they're not getting results for their kids, that they get help or they move out of the profession. That's happening, and yet we've got a lot of flat outcomes. So one of the things my team works on is there a way to, within the system we have, and the kids we have, and the teachers we have, accelerate outcomes, get to that next generation of learning. And one thing that we spend a lot of time thinking about is technology supports in the classroom. And the research that we're grounded in actually comes out of the one-to-one tutoring research that has been done over many decades in randomized controlled trials, and the results are always very similar, which is that kids that receive their primary instruction from a master teacher one-to-one, on average, perform at the same level as the 98th percentile of kids who experience group instruction. So back in the late 80s, Benjamin Bloom, you guys know Bloom's taxonomy of learning and all of that. Well, he also did some other work on this question, and he calls this the 2 sigma problem. Is there a way to get 2 sigma outcomes, 98th percentile outcomes on average, with group instruction when we know we can get it with one-to-one instruction, with kids of any background that come in as far behind or as on grade level as they are, that is replicable over and over and over with one-to-one instruction. We can't afford 50 million teachers in the country. If we could find 50 million great teachers, it'd be tough to afford them. We're struggling with 3 million teachers getting the profession to the level of quality we want it to be, so can technology help? There are lots of promising examples of this, by the way. And so those are the kinds of things that my team invests in. And are we going to get there in the next 2 or 3 years? We're not. But there's a lot of interesting innovation going on that's starting to pick up steam. So we invest in 3 things. One, and most importantly, in schools that are redesigning the way they think about organizing instruction to be focused on individual students. So we call it student-centered. And the commitment is to meet the needs of each child every day. And that might look a lot different than classrooms look today, where all of the incentives are organized and the organization itself is constructed to try to keep 25 or so kids with one teacher moving at about the same pace through about the same material at about the same time, because my God, how else are you going to do it? Technology actually can be an amazing support to teachers and to students in disaggregating how each kid is doing on which kinds of skills, what different levels of performance kids come in with, and what they might do next tomorrow based on that, and giving teachers the kinds of instructional supports and tools they need to actually manage those kinds of classrooms. So we're investing in those kinds of schools that are kind of rethinking from scratch how you might design that. And it looks like everything from a really high-performing urban middle school that you might go into, a KIPP school or a district school that's doing really well, but for about a quarter to a third of the day, kids are actually working on these adaptive learning software products that are not only building their basic skills while they work on them, they're generating enormous amounts of data about what each kid gets and doesn't get, and why they're not getting it, the deep misunderstandings, and making that data available to the teachers and the administrators in the school, so that 70 or 75% of time that they're spending with teachers and with their classmates in what looks like a more traditional classroom is much more informed in the way we get diagnostics on lots of other things in our lives. Like, this is not such a surprise in other industries, right? This is a pretty well-known phenomenon. There's another end of the spectrum that looks very different, though. An organization called New Classroom, some of you from New York might recognize it as School of One from back in the day. When it started, it has spun out of the New York City Department of Education and is now a nonprofit called New Classrooms. We fund them. They are an organization now that helps schools across the country implement a radically different approach to instruction, which is, walls get knocked down. You've got 4 or 5 teachers in a classroom of 125 or 150 kids, and teachers are focusing on the things they're best at in terms of lessons and kinds of instruction in small groups versus big groups versus projects. And there's this technology platform that every single day kids are interacting with, and it knows in minute detail what they should work on next, and which 3 or 4 things might work best for them based on what other kids like them have done in the past. It's just starting to scale up. I saw some halfway point results of their first 8 schools around the country outside of New York that are mind-blowing. If half of the results that they got in the first half of the year hold through the end of the year, it'll be difficult to ignore them. It's amazing what they're able to produce. So we're investing in those kinds of things. We also need lots of tools. If you're going to have a really personalized approach to learning and technology supports, not every kid is going to have necessarily the same kinds of results with the same sorts of tools. So we invest in content and tools. We think that the market has a big role to play here. It's about a $9 billion market, and there's tons of commercial activity going on that's actually quite good. So we think our role as philanthropists is to actually think about the incentives for performance. Because sometimes when a market really takes off and venture capitalists get involved, and we love them and we're glad they're there, they have exit requirements with their investors that could push those companies to deprioritize results for, say, scale. And so as philanthropists, we're thinking hard about how we can get into the game, not just with our voice, but with our dollars to have a seat at the table to help protect some of these early entrepreneurs that are building amazing things that are going to take off and really matter for kids, but they need some time. They have longer time horizons for investments, and so we're doing that in a number of ways. We're also doing it with nonprofits. Some of you might know Khan Academy. It's probably surprising if you didn't know Khan Academy. So Khan Academy is in my portfolio at the Gates Foundation. We've recently done an evaluation of what it's like to use Khan Academy in classrooms. That'll be coming out in a couple of weeks, and there'll be a public report on that. So those are the kinds of things. And then there are also just a host of policy issues that can get in the way of really thinking differently. Somebody in the crowd said amen. It's like... Yes. And so we're investing in those kinds of things through partners. So those are the 3 big areas for us: schools, content and tools, and what we call the enabling environment, the policy environment. We've done about $150 million of investments in that space since I arrived 3 years ago, and that'll start to really ramp up over the next couple of years as we see things that are working. So,
thank you, Stacey. Laureen, please.
Thank you. And it's wonderful to be here with everybody, and so invigorating to be at this summit with so many great women and so many people who are interested in education reform. Can you guys hear me? No. Okay.
Use your teacher voice.
I will use I've never taught, so I'll try to use a teacher voice. Is that better?
And a parent voice.
I have done that. So after I left HBS, I spent a lot of time in investment banking and venture capital. And when I retired, tried to take that knowledge and pour it into the social sector, and most specifically in education. My passion for education reform really comes from my past and my heritage, so I thought I would just tell you a little bit about that. My parents were both immigrants from Iraq, and they told lots of stories that made a big impression on me when I was younger. And probably the most impressionable was that when a girl was born, there was just great shame upon the family because she wasn't going to be an income-producing asset. And a boy was, to the point where girls were often hidden in basements because there was such shame on the family. So lo and behold, my parents, they didn't meet till they were here, but they came here, and what happened? Their firstborn was a girl. And so I was drilled into me that I was so lucky to be here, I was lucky to be in a place where I could get an education, that it was my obligation to get an education, to do that for myself, to never take it for granted, and that it was something that no one could ever take away from me. And so that powerful message from my youth has informed pretty much everything that I've done in education. And I hope that I became a lot more than just an income-producing asset. But anyway, that's a little bit about my past. So I tell you this in order just to let you know that I really believe that education is the cornerstone of our democracy, and that all of us have an obligation to work very hard to tear down anything that stands in the way of reforming education in this country. And I think we all can play a very important role in our own schools, in our own communities, in our own homes. And I think that we are uniquely positioned to do that with the skill set that we have from Harvard Business School. The question that John has posed of education reform, what's next? I think first I just want to stop and celebrate the fact that much has been done. As early as 10 years ago, the national conversation was not that any child can learn at all. And it seems like that conversation has sped up so quickly, but I can just remember it seems like yesterday that just wasn't something that was known. And so I think that we have to celebrate that and celebrate the many pockets of excellence that we do have. At the same time, I would say that the two things I think really need to happen is we need to take everyone's working so hard on their pockets of excellence, and there's no real shared knowledge. We're not really taking what is working best in the high-performing charter schools, in what we know about differentiated instruction and all of that, and building a shared canon of a platform that we can all take back into our communities that becomes the no-brainer conversation. So now the no-brainer conversation is, everybody can learn. Everybody has the possibility, capability to learn. But we need to really take that to another level and say, how is that going to happen? Because we know now. We know a lot. And we know a lot that we're not taking into we're not taking out there as much as we possibly can. So that's number one. Second thing is I do think that we have got to bring early childhood into the education agenda, into the education funding. And I don't know exactly what that looks like. I know what it doesn't look like. It doesn't look like more money for universal preschool delivered by providers that currently deliver it. That is not what it looks like. It looks a lot more like really innovative things like nurse-family partnerships that are intervening prenatal and, really working on what happens 0 to 3. And that is not really a part of the generalized national conversation, and it's certainly not in the education budget, education agenda, and I think that it really needs to be there. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Laureen. So Monique, if you would.
I'd like to start this morning by saying that I have just been completely taken by the quality and the capacity of women who have come to this event these past 2 days. I got home late last night and just talked my husband's ear off, who had had a long day of surgery and was just like, when is it going to stop? You're going back tomorrow, right? You can tell me more this weekend. So I am humbled by this, but I am also just completely inspired by it, because I do feel that one of the ways that we are going to fix the public education system in the United States is by human capital, raw, powerful, often women who are determined to do this a better way. So the fact that all of these women are here with that level of both energy and skill, I just find incredible. So I'm grateful to be here and grateful to be a part of this. I want to start by saying that I started my business career at the Quaker Oats Company in brand management, and I sold junk food to dogs. And I did it very well. However, I felt that might not be my calling, just long term. But I realized, although the industry didn't at the time, I realized that the skill set that I had learned from the Quaker Oats Company and from the Harvard Business School could be applicable in another context. And 20 years ago, when I made that transition, that other context, the education reform industry, was not really on board with the fact that my skills might be helpful to them. And so when I kind of welcome all of you into the education industry, because I know you're all going to retire and you're going to come my way, you can call me. I will help you figure out a way to have impact, that you may not be welcomed with open arms on your first day. So just hang in there with me. I would like to say that it is the skill set that you have and the abilities in marketing, in finance, in management, in all of those places are the skills that I have spent the last 20 years working with educational leaders to learn and to leverage so that they can be very strategic and thoughtful about how reform is happening and how we think about how we get the best possible teachers in front of the students that need them the most. So the work I'm doing now as president of Teach Plus involves working with some of our country's highest skilled urban teachers. And we focus specifically on the urban context because, as everyone has brought up, our struggles in public education are very tied to zip code and very, in many cases, tied to communities of poverty. So we work with teachers who have had a track record of success with these populations to teach them how to be leaders in their field, because it is human capital that is going to change this. We've tried the money version, and that hasn't worked. So we're going to combine money with human capital. And these teachers have taken on, and we have given them the capacity to take on leadership in policy, at the federal, state, and local district level, and in turnaround, literally being a part of the hands-on turnaround infrastructure of a school. And I'd like to share two examples of this because I think it shows the different ways that different people with different skill sets can be levers in this solution. The first is work that we did with teachers in Indianapolis, who Indianapolis is a district that is shrinking in size. So every year they have a policy, it's actually written into the union contract, that they fire 25% of their teaching force. Everybody gets a pink slip. And because they also have a policy of LIFO, last in, first out, basically any teacher who has less than 10 years of experience receives a pink slip every year. So if you're trying to raise a family and pay a mortgage and I don't know, just have a good summer. This is really not the way for it to happen. So we have the statistic now in the US where new teachers, when they come into the sector, are leaving at a rate of 50% annually. Do you think that number's a little higher in Indianapolis? Sure is. So we took a group of these teachers, some of which have 8 years of experience. They are experienced, they are high quality, they're great teachers. They just happen to don't have enough tenure to not get a pink slip every year. And we brought them to, they set up meetings with the union and with the superintendent and with some state legislators, and they actually got this LIFO law changed. And they got it changed to include something shocking other than the amount of years that you have in the district as the indicator. They have asked, as teachers, whether or not their skill and their success and the outcomes of their students could be a factor in the layoff process. So it's not the teachers who happen to just have 5 years of experience who get laid off. It's the teachers who aren't succeeding, who not only get a pink slip, but they actually may get an infrastructure then, because they've been identified as teachers with need, for support. So these teachers were very thoughtful about what it would take for them to be excited about staying in their profession. They wanted to be recognized for excellence, and they talked to their colleagues, and they realized that this was not an unusual thing. That there are almost 2 generations now of teachers who have grown up in this age of being expected to perform, and that data is part of the information that allows them to understand whether they and their students are succeeding. So these teachers have changed the way teachers are kept in that school system, and it's affected every teacher in the state now. Which is really exciting. So that's a kind of policy example. We had teachers in Boston who had a conversation with the superintendent, and they asked her, what is it that keeps you up at night? And she said, it's figuring out how to get teachers like you into our lowest performing schools in the district. And these teachers kind of straightened up because they all have, a social justice angle to this, and they went into urban school districts in order to change the world, and someone just told them they weren't actually in the schools that needed them the most. So she asked them, what are the conditions that would be necessary for you to go into those schools? They took this question very seriously. They surveyed colleagues, they did best practice research, they tested out several different models, and what they came up with is a program that they pitched to the superintendent where master teachers would be identified through kind of an open process. You'd bring your portfolio in, you would bring evidence, you'd do some model lessons, you'd go through a very rigorous selection process. Teachers would be selected and then go as a team, as a group of at least 25% of the teaching force in that building into a struggling school. Now, before everyone gets all dramatic, these struggling schools are literally in the bottom 5% in the state, and they have an annual teacher turnover of 50%. We are not kicking anybody out. We are infusing these schools with master teachers who we then spend time teaching how to be leaders in that building. And they are instructional leaders, they are grade level chairs, they are subject level chairs, and their workday, they're full-time teachers who lead the instructional discussions that happen on a twice a week in these schools, and they know how to analyze data, they know how to look at student work, they know how to lead collaborative discussions with their colleagues. They are building the capacity of every teacher in that building every week. In our pilot schools, in the 6 pilot schools in Boston, where we were working this past year, those teachers, those 38 teachers, took those schools from being in the bottom 5% of the district to the city's average in 2 years. These people are powerful. They are powerful because their skills and their leadership capacity has been directed in a way that benefits significantly larger groups of teachers and therefore students. So my challenge to myself and to all of you is to help me in this charge to figure out how to leverage human capital, the capital we have in this room, the capital that already exists in our school district. These teachers already existed in the school districts. I just put them in the places where they could have the most impact. And it makes an enormous difference. So I will stop with that.
Okay, great. Thank you,
Thank you.
to all of you. And we can give them applause. So you've heard 3 different approaches, whether it's a technology approach, a very strategic philanthropic approach, also thinking about targeted areas, whether it's early childhood, and human capital. So why don't I open it up to all of you, and what I'll do is I'll call on somebody, and if you want to direct it to all of them, please say so. If you want to direct it to one of them, if you could indicate that, that would be great. Why don't I start with Barbara up the top there?
I'm Barbara Bree. I'm the class of '76. I live in San Diego, and I'm on the advisory board for Math for America there. And I'd like to ask all of you how you work with the teachers' unions, which many of you as an impediment to making changes in schools and in the classrooms.
It's a great question. And, you know, I bet all of the teachers you just described, Monique, are union teachers, right? And so at the Gates Foundation, a big chunk of the K-12 education work is about teacher evaluation and teacher feedback. It's not the stuff I work on, but I have colleagues on the leadership team that lead that part of the work. And basically, the institutional point of view of the Gates Foundation is, look, where we agree, let's make common cause. Because strange bedfellows or unusual suspects together on things about which we agree can be incredibly powerful. And so the movement across many states and in some union contracts in districts where that's how the mechanism actually works in some places, to actually have performance of teachers make a difference for promotion over the long term could not have happened had the National Teachers Union, the AFT, not the NEA at the time, but the AFT, actually supported a version of it. They said, we're for it, but it has to be right. You know, we got to get the measures right. But that was just enough. It was just enough that they said, we'll be for it if we can find the right way to do it. Now all the fights are about the right way to do it, which is fine. I'm glad teachers are fighting about, let's get engaged in your profession and fight for a better profession. And you know, the work that Monique's organization is doing, which we help support, is about trying to find those teachers within those union ranks that can be leaders for the next generation, not only in their buildings and in their districts, but of the union infrastructure. About 18 months ago, Bill Gates and Randy Weingarten, who's the elected president of the American Federation of Teachers, and for a long time was the head of the New York City, which is the largest organized labor local in the country, any profession, wrote a joint op-ed about teacher development. Now, they disagree on most everything. I can promise you they disagree on most everything. But on this point, they agreed. and they wrote a joint op-ed on it. It's really powerful. It's really powerful. And so I guess the summary is, are teachers' unions blockers? Probably in many instances. Are they in some ways incredibly helpful in pushing forward the profession and the performance for kids? They sure are. But it's not easy. One thing I would challenge, a lot of us actually live in places where the union, because we live in urban areas, we live in places where the unions are highly organized and have a lot of power. But I would just challenge you, I grew up in the South, and the unions actually aren't very powerful there at all. And the performance still sucks for kids. So I think we have to get real about, right? We have to get real about the challenges and say, yep, in a lot of places, it's the unions that are really struggling. But, man, there's a whole lot going on in places where the unions actually don't have much power at all. And you look zip code to zip code to zip code, and if you didn't know actually what part of the country it was in, you'd have no idea if that was a union zip code or not. And for black and brown kids and for low-income kids, the results look the same, regardless of what part of the country they're in. So I think we really have to grapple with that.
I have one thing.
Okay.
So I have one of my favorite union factoids. In the New York City Union, you get to do your voting at different kind of borough stations around the city. And the second largest voting station in the New York City Unions is in Boca Raton, Florida. Retirees can vote in union elections. So that's part of why unions change as slowly as they do, because there is.
That's why anybody with 8 years and under can get a pink slip every year in Indianapolis.
Exactly. So, given that as the context, we work very closely with unions because our teachers are members of unions. And what we're trying to help both them do and help the union do is have a conversation with the teachers who are currently teaching now. Because the teachers who are not teaching anymore actually have more time to have the conversation than the teachers who are currently teaching. And what's really exciting right now is that union leadership gets this. They get that the teachers they want to develop a rigorous dialogue with are teachers with 0 to 15 years of experience, because that is the future of the profession. So we will actually be engaging in a partnership with the NEA, which we will announce next week, to help in that dialogue. So keep the conversation open. They are the primary voice of teachers right now, so they cannot be ignored.
Let me come to this side of the room. Eleanor?
Lauren, I have to commend you very highly for bringing up the whole issue of preschool education. I work with an agency that deals with homeless families, and we are in the process of starting a Montessori school for the children of these families. And I can tell you from working with them that a 3-year-old from a homeless family has a developmental age of 18 months to 2 years. Without having any kind of preschool, walking into a kindergarten class as unprepared as these children are, dooms them to failure. Fortunately, in Dallas, Texas, where I live, there are beginnings of a number of programs to address these. We have parents as teachers. We are working with a number of preschools, mostly Montessori, that have started in the inner city to try to address this. But I can't commend you enough for bringing this and highlighting the need for preschool education, particularly for those of disadvantaged background.
Well, thank you. At Bell, we work. It's a very intensive academic intervention for K to 8 students, and I think what's not known is exactly what you just said, which is that gap is where they start. The biggest part of the gap is at the entry, and so we're constantly making catch up with the entry. If we could close the gap when they came in, it wouldn't be a remedial beginning. And but we've got to figure out how to turn on the spigot of funding into quality interventions there.
Okay, so let me come over here. Carol?
Hi, I'm Carolyn Chin, class of 71. I've been working with Bronx Community College, which is at the bottom of the city university system, 50% attrition. And not everyone can go to Harvard, but about 50% of everyone going to college is going to a junior or community college. And I'm a techie. I started Ecommerce Onions. I believe, after studying that we can have a radical change in outcome using technology. The union faculty don't want to advise. We can use expert systems to either help the faculty want to advise, meaningfully, or have students work on it. I think use of tools based on technology. We can do edutainment. I have branded learning. I mean, one of the things I would like to see someone like a Glamour magazine give tips on how to ace the interview, how to dress for, how to do that. There's the glamour factor or the cool factor, and it's a way students want to learn. So I believe that if we can do some of these things, this can be scalable, mass customizable to apply to a very large percentage of junior colleges. And also we can, we can use it in other areas. So I'm saying though that we're talking about pre-K, K to 12, and college, that I think somewhere along the line, there should be some thought of a more holistic system that thinks to support from pre to all those areas. And I think with technology tools, not to replace humans, but to enhance in some cases there are no humans to give this advice, that it could make a huge difference. Now, I don't know if anybody's working on that, but it seems like we tend to go after these things in bits and pieces and not think of the potential of leveraging what's already there and reusing it and repurposing it.
Stacey or Laureen or Monique, do you have examples of interconnecting these areas?
So, Carolyn, you're right. There's not nearly the kind of coherence you'd, as a business person, we so want along the value chain, right? Where you have the challenge that Eleanor described, seemingly disconnected from the K-12 work, as Laureen pointed out, and then the community college pipeline being disconnected. So there are a few states that are starting to try to think much more holistically about their systems. Illinois is thinking hard about this. In Louisiana, John King is the chief there. He's starting to develop this vision. I hope he gets a chance to actually get proactive and positive with his vision rather than all the firefighting he's always doing. But the way he talks about it is every person born in Louisiana should have every tool and support they need from early childhood throughout their life to manage their learning, for their families to manage their learning, for them to manage their learning themselves, for them to manage every opportunity they have throughout their lifetime, and that the state education system ought to be supporting a vision like that. So I think there's just some early work there. It's certainly not where the movement of ed reform has been over the last couple of decades, but I think it's really powerful and exciting.
Do we even have the research to understand what we really need to do? I don't know.
In terms of practices,
Yes.
I would say no. I think there are these isolated bodies of research kind of along the chain, and I think there is research about what happens earlier in one's education and its effect on lifelong earnings and other kinds of social outcomes.
Americans are the best students in the best and worst schools. And it seems to me if we could do some kind of understanding why that happens. Because these are Americans. Okay.
So I'm going to move on, but one of the tensions that I think this conversation is eliciting is this notion of early childhood. We know that, for example, if a student can't read proficiently by third grade, their life outcomes are very predictable in terms of their college graduation rates and so on. But then when you have this tension with limited resources, where do you invest? Do you invest early or do with the teacher? So Courtney?
I have just probably a more ignorant question because I'm in the business side. I'm not really involved in education, but I'm interested in it. And one thing that you have all said, which I find fascinating, is we're working within the system as we have it now, right? We're engaging with the teachers' unions. We're accepting the structure presumably, even though you've all talked about the issues by zip code, we're accepting the fact that schools are financed through property taxes and that kind of system. And I'm just curious if you can give us some insight into how has that debate evolved? Are we kind of past the point of real sort of revolution with respect to education? And is really the thinking that we kind of need to work within the bounds of what we have? Or is there a dual track and we're really just talking about the one track in this discussion, but there is another track that is more kind of revolutionary? I don't know. I don't have a judgment about it. I'm just curious.
I wonder if that's a good question for either Laureen or Monique. One of you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a dual track. I think there are two things going on. The interesting thing is the funding doesn't, for anything to be scalable, you've got to get government funding involved. And that's very slow to repurpose for lots of policy reasons that we all know. And so the dual track, I think, is happening in a lot of the innovative work that, you see being done. And, being able to repurpose federal money to move in those directions, I think, will be the challenge.
I do think that technology is starting to really, really push on the boundaries of how schools are constructed right now. But you're right on the money with the primary funding source being a fairly limiting factor.
Yeah, unlike other many countries, the U.S. constitutionally we're not allowed to do it at the federal level, so they have to use other influential factors and it's mostly done by state and local. I'll go with Janet.
Yeah, I guess it was just this past week, the results of a national study on teacher evaluations that had all been revised. I think actually your foundation funded, I could be wrong, but a lot of energy was put into trying to identify talented teacher, evaluate across the board, unions bought in. And in a way, I think very disciplinedly, I'm an active member of Teach for America's board in Newark, as well as on my board in Short Hills, which is an affluent, high-performing district. So for comparative purposes, I think the issues with the union and performance evaluations of 15 minutes a year, et cetera, is the same in both. So it was disappointing in that the results came out, lots of money was spent on designing new evaluation forms, and when the evaluations came out, 90-something% of all teachers, 98% were deemed. So first of all, there's on so many levels, this is disturbing to me because good money was spent on, a lot of money we all know.
50 million.
Yeah, 50 million. So if we could synopsize for those who might not be familiar with it, but I would really like to hear two things. Where do you think this goes, and how do you, working in this industry, which I'm extremely passionate about, keep yourself going and not getting frustrated after that?
Wish you could see the body language on this side of the table.
Did I hit a nerve here? Did I hit a nerve?
No, it's the work every day, right? So yeah, $50 million into a randomized controlled trial study over multiple years. And when I say randomized, the teachers weren't random. They were selected in a number of districts. The students were randomly assigned to teacher classrooms so that you couldn't say, oh, that teacher just got the better kids. By the way, it's the hardest thing in education to do, is to do gold standard research with randomized controlled trials with children randomly assigned into teachers' classrooms, because you won't let it happen. Those of you who have kids in public schools, probably even if those of you who have kids in private schools, you know who the best teachers are, or who you think the best teachers are, and you will move heaven and earth to make sure your kid gets that one and not that one. I'm not criticizing you, by the way. Yeah, of course you do. Everybody does. So it's hard to do, but this was done. And yes, measures were identified that are more predictive of student outcomes, and those have been published, and they're getting integrated into evaluation systems around. But there's still behavior of managers and leaders and peers in that system that take those and then go into classrooms. And this ethic, right, this is the union, non-union part of the country challenge in the profession, where what matters is that we're all kind of the same and feeling good about it. And how's it going to change? I'm not sure, except for people like those of us in this room to be outraged by that and say there's no way that 25% of the class of 2012 scored on the ACT at a level that predicts to see or better, and that 98% of the that teachers in the country are good. Like, that can't be true.
Possible.
In the last 1 minute, I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative to ask a question for each of you, and we're going to try to get it on time. So there's some statistic that since 1999, that the number of not-for-profit organizations involved in education has doubled in this country. And all of you are, by just your questions and your participation, are passionate about this. So what advice would you give the audience about how to choose among so many different options to get involved? What would you say? How can they get involved, and how would you choose the organization to do so? Monique.
I would choose the organization that connects most directly to what you are most interested in, whether it's early education, whether it is college, whatever the lever is that is right for you from an interest level, then that's the place you should go. And then take the skill you have and figure out where it fits in the system. If you spend any time looking at whatever that piece of the education industry is that you're focused on, you will see the holes. They're not hidden. They're gigantic. 25%, 85%, they're really big. So walk into the hole and kind of figure out where you can be helpful. And there are a lot of HBS alum now who are in the education industry, so reach out to them. They will respond. We will figure out a way to use your capacity.
Great. Laureen?
Yes, I would agree with that completely, and just, invite everybody to just jump in. And I'll give you a little bit of warning. You're often going to want to be plugged into a fundraising slot. And don't accept that. I mean, be helpful in the fundraising slot, but your skills are a lot greater and deeper than that. There are enormous governance issues with these nonprofits. There are enormous capacity building issues. There are enormous strategic issues. And so just be very adamant about entering into areas where you can make great impact, and don't just get plugged into a slot where you're not using your best skills.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
Laureen
Stacey.
said what I was going to say, so I'll say something. I won't, and it's good. I won't answer your question, John. I'm going to say something else. I'll tell you why I get up and do this every day. So I grew up in Southeast Texas, and Congresswoman Barbara Jordan was like this looming figure back then. She was a woman. She was black. She was sitting at the congressional table putting the President of the United States on trial, and I was a little girl watching this on television. She's a hero of mine. She's very quotable. Here's something she said. What Americans want from their country is very simple. They just want an America that lives up to its promise. And that's what this is about. The promise of America isn't that zip code to zip code to zip code, we get different chances. The promise of America is no matter where you're born, who your parents were, what language they spoke, how much money they made, you've got a shot in this country. Everybody in this room had it. I had it, Laureen had it, Monique had it, and we have very different backgrounds. Every kid in America deserves that, because that's what America promises. So that's what gets me animated about this and plugging through all of the difficulty. And I would just challenge you that it's going to be really hard when you engage, because whatever nonprofit you love is going to have this constituency against it that's going to actually fight against it. To remember that what we're actually trying to do in the best way we know how is create an America that lives up to its promise, and that's worth working on every single day.
Okay. Thank you so much.